Charles read the same line twice, then took off his glasses while William stood opposite him, and Camilla sat a few feet away, already knowing what the page would do. The document in his hands was more than 20 years old, and it did not prove a crime. It proved that the lesson he had built about himself had never fully belonged to him. Camilla recognized the copy at once. The paper needed no introduction for her. The heading, the familiar pressure of the pen, the date that still lived in her memory, all arrived together. She did not deny the sequence. She sat with the knowledge already settled while Charles turned the sheet again, slower now, as if the second reading might rearrange what the first had shown. Only after the date, after the signature, after the plain words beneath, did the meaning reach him fully. This was not the closure he remembered signing. This was the instruction that had stopped it. William said nothing at first. The room held the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon, yet none of them touched the space between the three of them. Charles kept the page open. He had believed for years that the decision had been his alone to withdraw. The document said otherwise. Camilla's name sat where the chain of release had broken. She had signed, while the notice still waited inside the trust, 78 minutes before it would have gone out. The hold had been real. The silence that followed it had lasted far longer. For 2 decades, Charles believed he had pulled back from closing Bridge House before the decision became irreversible. The family story had always been simple. Under pressure, he had nearly shut the place down, then changed his mind. Later, he treated that week as proof he knew when to stop himself. The memory matched the ending he could see. The project continued. A revised arrangement was found, and he approved it. What the memory never contained was the order of events that made the ending possible. William had believed that story too. He remembered the sawdust and the thick mugs of tea from boyhood visits, and he remembered his father's later telling of the near miss. The document altered the sequence without altering the outcome. Camilla had stepped in first. Charles's signature had already been on the closure instruction the evening before. Distribution marks showed the notice prepared to move outward. Her suspension stopped the chain before the first copy left. Only afterward did he return, calmer, and choose again. He had never fully understood the moment he thought he had mastered. The lesson he carried was built on sand he had not known was shifting under him. 9 days before the confrontation, William was driving toward Windsor when his office put through a call from the administrator of an old charitable property trust linked to one of Charles's projects. An archive store was closing. Most of the files set for redistribution were ordinary ledgers, routine correspondence, the dry residue of years that no longer needed space. One document was not ordinary. The administrator spoke carefully over the line while the road unspooled ahead of William, the familiar stretch carrying him toward a house dense with layered history. He listened without interrupting, the wheel steady under his hands, as the man described an original suspension instruction connected to Bridge House, a residential training project Charles had supported years earlier. When the page later reached him, Camilla's signature sat clear upon it, and the date was one William already knew. The heading named a withdrawal and suspension instruction. It did not cancel a closure. It ordered a 72-hour hold. Release of the termination notice had been due at 5 that afternoon. Camilla had signed at 3:42:78 minutes before the order would have left the trust. The timing lodged in him and would not loosen. Something about the sequence already felt wrong against the story the family had always told. Bridge House had been a practical place, not a symbol. It offered residential training for young people who had fallen out of school or early employment, carpentry, horticulture, restoration work, the beginnings of small business skill. Charles had cared about it deeply, the kind of care that showed in the hours he gave and the questions he asked. William and Harry had visited as boys. William still carried the sensory memory of those days, the smell of sawdust in the workshops, thick mugs of tea passed without ceremony, and his father absorbed in long talk of stonework and craft, listening as if the young trainee's efforts mattered as much as any larger duty. The family story attached to the place had always been simple. Under pressure, Charles had nearly shut Bridge House down, then changed his mind. Years later, he treated that week as proof he knew when to stop himself before a permanent decision hardened into regret. The memory matched the ending everyone could see. The order of events William was beginning to understand might not. What reached William next was not rumor but a single administrator's page from the old charitable property trust. It carried Camilla's signature and a date he knew at once. The heading was a withdrawal and suspension instruction. It did not cancel a closure already finished. It ordered a 72-hour hold. Release of the termination notice had been due at 5 that afternoon. Camilla had signed at 3:42:78 minutes before the notice would have left the trust and become public fact. The family version had always been simple and useful. Under pressure, Charles had nearly shut Bridge House down, then changed his mind. Years afterward, he treated that week as proof he knew when to stop himself before a permanent decision hardened into regret. The story comforted him. It became part of the lesson he told about judgment under strain. Yet the page did not describe a man catching himself in time. It described an order already prepared and a second hand that arrested it before the first copy could move. The hold bought 3 days. Whatever followed those 3 days had been allowed to look like reconsideration alone. William, read the timing again. 5 o'clock, 3:42, 78 minutes. The numbers were ordinary and absolute. They left no room for the softer account that had lived in the family for so long. Charles had acted. Something had stopped the action from completing its path. Only afterward had the ending everyone remembered taken shape. The memory still matched what survived. The order of events did not. At the archive, William placed 2 pages side by side under the same light. Charles's signature sat on the closure instruction, signed the evening before. Camilla's sat on the suspension. After the hold, termination was never released. A revised funding arrangement was considered instead. Bridge House continued. Charles later approved the alternative and kept the place open. The ending still matched the memory he had carried. The sequence that produced that ending did not. Distribution marks showed the closure had been prepared to move outward through the trust. The suspension stopped that chain before the first copy left. 1 day apart, the 2 signatures told a quieter story than the one Charles had lived by. He had signed to end the project. She had signed to freeze the ending. What followed the revised structure, the continued training, the approval he later gave rested on the hours she had purchased and the options that appeared inside them. William stood with both pages in front of him and felt the old lesson shift under its own weight. The decision Charles remembered as his own restraint had first been interrupted by another hand, then rebuilt into a choice he could still recognize as mercy toward the work and the young people inside it. On the closure instruction, the distribution marks were plain once William looked for them. The notice had been prepared to travel outward to staff who would have to pack rooms and end placements, to partners who held the lease and the training contracts, to families who had trusted the house with their sons and daughters. It was not a private memorandum left on a desk. It carried the machinery of release, lists, timing, the quiet administrative path that turns a signature into a public fact. Charles had signed the evening before. By Friday afternoon, the paper was ready to leave the trust and become irreversible in other people's lives. Camilla's suspension stopped that chain before the first copy moved. The hold sat on top of the termination and froze every outward step. From Charles's side of the day, nothing dramatic appeared to happen. No crisis call reached him. No trustee rang with second thoughts. The notice simply failed to depart. Staff continued their ordinary work. Trainees still swept sawdust and measured timber. The project remained open because the instruction that would have closed it never crossed the threshold of the office. The interruption was administrative, almost invisible, and complete. William set the 2 pages together again and saw how little noise had been required to change the ending Charles later claimed as his own restraint. William found Peter Wren, the former trustee's secretary, living in quiet retirement near Bath. Wren was not surprised by the visit, only disappointed that the page had survived. He admitted at once that Charles had never known. That week, costs were rising, and the newspapers had begun to twist the project into something uglier. Stories claimed one of Charles's charities was manufacturing sympathetic publicity, and they dragged the boys' private visits, William and Harry walking through workshops as children, into arguments about Charles as a father. A difficult family conversation had already gone badly after another private matter reached the press. Exhaustion and certainty met in the same man. Charles arrived at the trustees, meeting certain that if Bridge House had become a place where staff, trainees, and even his sons could be pulled into public fights about him, the responsible act was to close it quickly. He signed on Thursday evening. Wren took the notice and prepared it for release. The pressure of money and the pressure of reputation had fused into one decision. Wren remembered the tone more than the exact words. A man who believed he was protecting everyone by cutting the thing away before it could be used against him again. Peter Wren remembered the arrival more clearly than the argument that followed. Charles came into the trustees' room already spent, coat still on, the fatigue sitting in his shoulders as if he had carried it from the car. There was no raised voice and no performance of resolve. He was simply certain. Bridge House, he said, had stopped being only a place of work and training. It had become a surface on which other people could write their stories about him. And once that happened, the people inside it, staff, trainees, even the boys who had once walked its workshops, were no longer safe from the spectacle. Closing it quickly was, in his mind, the responsible act, protection dressed as finality. reality. Ren took the signed notice that Thursday evening without treating it as a gesture or a warning meant to be walked back. The paper felt like an ending already decided. Costs had climbed. The press had turned private visits into material about Charles as a father. A difficult family conversation had already gone badly. In that light, the signature did not read as anger alone. It read as a man deciding that the cleanest mercy was to cut the project free before it could be used against him or against anyone still standing near him one more time. Friday afternoon, before the notice could leave the trust, Camilla called. Her first question was practical and exact. Had the instruction gone? When Ren told her it had not, she answered without pause. Don't send it. She held no authority to overrule the board, and she did not pretend otherwise. What she asked for was times 72 hours, and Ren, hearing the edge in her voice, drafted a formal suspension request for her signature rather than invent a power she did not possess. She sounded frightened, not merely strategic. Charles had barely slept. He had been angry for days and would not hear her when she tried to talk him away from closure. She wanted the hold so that the irreversible step would not harden while he was still inside that state. If he asked directly why termination had been stopped, Ren was to tell him the truth. Unless he asked, she did not want her name volunteered. Ren would not lie for her. She accepted the record as it would stand, and she did not ask him to destroy the original closure notice. The chain simply stopped before the first copy moved outward, leaving the decision suspended between what had already been signed and what had not yet been released. She left Ren with no room to invent cover. If Charles asked, directly and by name, why the termination had not left the trust, the answer was to be plain. A signed suspension had held it, and her signature was on the page. Ren was not to soften the wording or shift the credit elsewhere. What she refused was the unsolicited offer of her name when no question had been put. She would not have him volunteer the story across a meeting table or in a corridor conversation. Silence, until asked, was not the same as a lie, and she would not cross into fabrication. She asked for nothing further. There was to be no quiet editing of the file, no backdated note suggesting the closure had never been final, no instruction to destroy the notice Charles had signed the evening before. Ren was to leave that original exactly where it sat. By the time her call came through, the office had already begun the practical work that followed a decision of that scale. Contracts were being listed for early release. Trainees were being mapped toward other placements in other towns. Staff had started the sober arithmetic of winding a residential project down. The suspension stopped the first outward copies, yet it did not erase the machinery already in motion. Camilla accepted the unfinished state. She wanted 72 hours in which an exhausted man might still turn back, not a fiction in which the first choice had never been written down at all. By Monday, the anger had somewhere else to go, and Charles asked for fresh numbers as if the reconsideration had been his alone. The hidden stop vanished inside what looked, from the outside, like a man catching himself before permanence. The memory that later served him so well began there, in the gap between a signed termination and a decision never released. No one at the table that morning offered the fuller sequence. The intervention simply disappeared into the version he preferred. It had not waited for Monday. On Saturday morning, before Charles requested anything, Camilla telephoned the project director. Helen Marsh took the call at home. Camilla did not order her to save Bridge House. She asked only whether, if Charles returned after the weekend and wanted another way, one would exist in usable form. Perhaps was not enough. Helen listed lease costs, remaining capacity, staffing numbers, and the exact funding gap. Camilla told her to put it on a single page. Within the hour, trustees were already working the figures into an alternative structure, a reduced residential model, an adjusted lease, training preserved at lower cost and lower exposure. The machinery that had begun to dismantle the project was quietly redirected toward keeping a thinner version alive, so that when he was ready to choose again, the choice would be real. Helen Marsh, who had directed the project in those years, remembered the Saturday call with the precision of someone who had carried it quietly ever since. Camilla did not order her to save Bridge House. She asked only whether, if Charles returned on Monday and asked for another way, one would already exist. A vague, perhaps, was not enough. Helen listed the obstacles without ornament. Lease costs still running, remaining capacity, staffing numbers that could not simply vanish, and the precise funding gap that had driven the crisis. Camilla told her to put it on a single page. The trustees took that page and reduced the residential model, adjusted the lease, and kept the training alive at lower cost and lower public exposure. Afterward, Camilla said she wanted no credit and no mention of who had asked. If he chooses it, she told Helen, he needs to know he chose it. The line stayed with with William longer than any other detail, because it named the thing Camilla had decided to protect, not the buildings or the scheme, but the possibility that Charles might still meet a real choice when he was able to make one. When William placed the copy in front of her, Camilla recognized it at once. She admitted Charles had never known. She denied none of the sequence. William laid out the signed closure, moving toward release, the 72-hour hold, the quiet preparation of an alternative, the silence that hardened from one evening into 20 years. She said simply that Charles was making a mistake. William answered that it was his mistake to make. She rejected the wording that he was unfit, yet she did not reject the substance. She had decided he was not in a state where an irreversible choice should be allowed to become irreversible. She had meant to tell him that same weekend. By Monday, he was calmer, asking about the young people and the revised numbers, speaking as though he had caught himself in time. She let the version stand. The memory became useful to him. She asked William to show the page because Charles deserved the truth, not because William was angry with her. What began as a single evening's hesitation settled into something far heavier. She had intended the truth for that weekend, while the hold still felt temporary and the papers still warm from the printer. Monday arrived differently. Charles woke quieter, asked after the trainees and the numbers, and spoke in the tone of a man who believed he had pulled himself back from the edge. The story fitted him. It gave him proof that under pressure, he could still recognize excess and choose restraint. Once that version took root, silence was no longer merely the concealment of an act. It became the protection of a belief he now carried about his own judgment. Each year that passed made confession costlier. To speak would not only reveal the stop she had placed on the notice, it would unmake the private lesson he had drawn from the week and used thereafter. The gap between what happened and what he remembered widened until it hardened into 20 years of carefully maintained quiet. She watched him live inside that improved memory and did not disturb it. William spoke briefly with Anne. She did not argue whether Bridge House's survival had been good for the young people or for Charles's later reputation. She asked a narrower question, whether a favorable outcome altered who had held the right to make the original decision. Protecting a man from one irreversible choice, she said, did not confer the right to protect him forever from the knowledge that the protection had occurred. The distinction stayed with William. He decided the ground he would stand on. When he faced his father, he would offer only the narrower truth. The first decision had already been signed and was moving toward release. Camilla had stopped that chain and arranged another option before the notice could leave the trust. Nothing more, nothing dressed in motive or outcome. The rest would belong to Charles once the page was in his hands. Charles had expected only a private talk. William set the old page on the table between them without preface or apology. For a moment, Charles treated it as ordinary trust paper, the kind that once crossed his desk in stacks. Then his eyes caught Camilla's signature and the precise heading that ordered a 72-hour suspension. He stopped. The room went still while he read the same line twice. He removed his glasses and held them loosely, as if the weight of the paper had suddenly increased. William stood opposite him. Camilla sat a few feet away, already knowing what the page would do. The document was more than 20 years old. It did not prove a crime. It proved that the lesson he had built about himself had never fully belonged to him. He looked from the yellowed sheet to his son, and then to the woman who had signed it in the late afternoon before release. His voice was quiet when he asked whether she had let him believe the decision had been his alone. She did not look away. She answered yes. Yes, she had signed the suspension. Yes, she had stopped the chain before the first copy left the trust. Yes, she had arranged that another option would be waiting when he returned on Monday. The narrower truth William had chosen to offer now sat complete in Charles's hands, and the rest of the silence belonged to him. Camilla claimed no right, not love, not the survival of Bridge House, not the gratitude of anyone who had later thrived there. She said she had hoped the anger would drain over the weekend and that he would ask for another way. Yet she was clear. If on Monday he had still wanted the doors closed, she would have let the original order go. She had only meant to give the decision back to him once the worst of the storm had passed. She had never meant the pause to harden into a story he would carry for 2 decades as proof that he alone had caught himself in time. Charles heard what lay beneath the words. She had appointed herself the judge of when he was truly himself and when he was not. She had decided that an irreversible choice must not become irreversible while hurt still wore the face of principle. And then, when Monday came and he spoke as a man who had reconsidered, she had chosen the memory for him as well. She had let the cleaner version stand until silence itself became another kind of decision. Renewed every year, he repeated the tale. He did not raise his voice. He simply simply held the page and understood that the protection had reached further than the project. It had reached into the account he kept of his own character, and she had written that account without his knowledge. He left without spectacle. The room held its quiet. No door slammed, no demand was made in the moment. Charles kept the appointments already set for the days that followed, moving through them with the same measured public face he had always managed when private ground had shifted beneath him. Only afterward did he ask for the ordered record, the full sequence from Thursday evening through Monday morning. He wanted the termination instruction bearing his own signature, the suspension that had halted its release, the revised funding notes that had appeared by the weekend, and the withdrawal he had later approved as if it had been his first clear thought. The papers arrived without ceremony. He read them in order, once, then again, tracing how one decision had been prepared to leave the trust and how another hand had stopped the chain before the first copy moved. Later he saw Camilla alone. He asked if she had been frightened. Not of him, she answered, but of what he was doing to himself in those exhausted hours, hurt, dressed as principle, anger named protection. She had watched him arrive at the trustees' meeting certain that closing Bridge House was the responsible act, and she had known the certainty would not survive the weekend if given air. After Monday, when he had already grown calmer and begun speaking of the young people and another way forward, she admitted there had been no defense left. Only the deception remained, quiet and complete, renewed each time he told the cleaner version of the story. He did not tear the pages. Charles gathered the termination, the suspension, and the record of reconsideration into one set, placed them himself into the archive envelope, and closed it. He kept the full sequence together rather than scattering or destroying any part of it. The documents stayed as they were evidence of the order in which things had actually happened, and of the gap between that order and the memory he had carried for more than 20 years. There was no public reckoning, no announcement. The envelope simply remained in his keeping, a private ledger of what had been withheld and what had finally been returned to him. William had shown him the hidden page for one reason only. Charles deserved the choice Camilla had denied him for too long. Not the choice about Bridge House, that decision had already been lived and revised, but the quieter, harder choice of what to do with the truth once it stood complete in his hands. For 2 decades, the protection had reached past the project and into the account he kept of his own character. Now the pages sat together, closed yet preserved, and the decision about their meaning belonged to him alone.